So he was originally born with the last name, I'm going to have to look at this to say it, Deutschendorf.
Yeah, Deutschendorf.
Deutschendorf, yeah. And one of his friends at the start of his career came up to him and was like, that's not going to fit on the marquee. You're going to need to change your name. So
Sage advice.
Yeah, so he changed it to Denver because he loved Denver.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. I think you'll like today's show, at least if you're over age 50. I just grabbed that age. Marlea, I bet that you didn't know much about this person that you're about to introduce.
Not a ton, but I knew the songs, some of the songs. So
yes. I mean, kind of an icon, like an American songbook in many ways, at least of an era, the 70s, and mainly 70s, part of the 80s, part of the 60s. So this is somebody who, again, we talk about the life of these celebrities, their death, and the opportunities we can learn about their planning. They're planning for the balance of their life, and especially they're planning for thereafter, the estate matters and trusts and wills, et cetera. So this week, tell us about our subject.
Yeah, today we are going to be discussing John Denver. So John Denver, as many of you probably know, is one of the biggest folk artists from the 1970s. He has over 300 songs. He had wrote 200 or more of those. He, very influential in wilderness, just political movements, so on and so forth. He's won 2 Grammys, was inducted into many Hall of Fames. He just all kinds of things. Charted the billboards multiple times.
He was a multi-talented guy.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about his life in a second, but I really like to dwell on how talented he was. And in a way, he wasn't taken as seriously by what we would call the avant-garde, the musicians who consider themselves musicians or vocalists. I mean, these are people who tried to avoid becoming too popular, thinking that it somehow meant that you were too commercial, that you weren't serious. I'm not clear on what that prejudice is, but I know that prejudice existed against Denver in his profession. Mm-hmm. He seemed very healthy and mainstream and happy, and everything was cool, and he was just a very buoyant personality, a person who excelled on screen. He was multi-talented. The fact that he could play very well, he played often a 12-string guitar, which the fundamentals of a 12-string are the same as a 6-string, but people who play guitar, and I do it not seriously, but I know that somebody who can excel playing a 12-string guitar, it really is a special talent. But he was a good guitarist anyway. And apart from that, he was a wonderful writer, and he wrote songs that others had made hits of. Mm-hmm. And his voice was just incredible. Let me plug there's a website called Wings of Pegasus. Have you ever heard of it?
I saw that in my research, kind of. Actually, I've seen it before.
Yeah, Wings of Pegasus. There is a guy, Phil is his name, F-I-L is what he goes by. Anyway, he's a little bit geeky, but I'm telling you, if you want to see analysis of music, and whether it's instrumentalists or vocalists, but especially vocalists, he really does a great, very professional job. And he's very analytical. And he'll take famous singers, famous instrumentalists, and he will look at their performances in a very fair but insightful way. And he took John Denver. He's done a couple of shows on John Denver, and he's really wowed when he puts it on the pitch monitor and other software that he uses to look at how well someone hits notes. And this is without pitch correction. Pitch correction is commonly used today to cover up for the fact when musicians don't hit the mark precisely. Yes. So he'll put somebody like Denver on this pitch monitor software, and you can watch it as he goes through songs. man, the purity of Denver's voice, it just is amazing. And his ability to land just where he wants to land and the range of his voice. He really was a wonderful singer. So he had, of course, the musical talents. He was a nice-looking guy, which also helps. So he kind of had the package. And then he managed to get, not surprisingly, some shows. I know he had his own show for a while. He's a regular guest on a number of shows. I think at the Grammys, he hosted the Grammys.
5 times.
5 times at the Grammys. So he's somebody who was very telegenic, very charming, very likable, and he was sought out for these roles on television. Again, that's something apart from his musicianship. And then finally, he had the ability to act.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying he won an Academy Award.
No, but he was very talented. Like you said, I remember, I actually seen this episode, but he was on The Muppets multiple times.
Oh, I remember that. I'd forgotten it.
Yeah. But he did have the ability to act. I mean, he wasn't in, anything huge, but he was in the film Oh God and the comedy, and
I remember
everybody
that.
loved him in that. And I just think it's so interesting that he could go from singer-songwriter to actor.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
It was exceptional. Now, of course, those of you who watch the show know that I'm a huge, huge Sinatra fan. Now, Sinatra he won at least one Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and he was nominated at least one more time. And he was a great actor and a great musician, great singer. But Denver just had, he had a whole lot of talent in a whole lot of ways. So he is very popular, but sadly, to some extent, I feel like he's been a little forgotten.
I feel that same way. I mean, everybody, especially my age, we all know, Country Roads Take Me Home, or Take Me Home Country Roads. That's, the theme song of a lot of things.
It kind of introduced his career.
Yeah, but I don't think a lot of people recognize that it's John Denver. And I think when people, especially my age, hear that name, it kind of rings a bell, but they're kind of like, I'm not quite sure what he sings. And it's just wild to me.
Yeah, you do hear his songs regularly. Maybe the channels I listen to, but the point is, he's still around, thankfully. So Marley thought this was a fitting subject, and I agree. So let's go back and talk about his childhood and how he entered the music business.
Yeah, he was born in 1943 in Roswell, New Mexico, and his dad was an Army pilot, a very decorated Army pilot, so he was kind of an Army brat. He moved to Tucson, Arizona from ages 6 to 14, and while he was in Tucson, he sang in the boys' choir. And his grandma at the age 11 gave him his first guitar, and that kind of kicked off his whole I love music thing. He loved Arizona, and then unfortunately the family had to move again, and then they moved one more time after. They moved to Alabama, and then they moved one more time after that to Fort Worth, and he was not a fan of it.
Not a Texan.
Yeah, no. And it's his family dynamic is really interesting too. He stated that his father didn't really show much love for his kids, and I'm thinking, that just has to do a lot with military.
Yeah, distant.
Yes,
guy, strong.
yeah. So I'm sure that he was raised in a very strict household and everything, and his third year of high school in Fort Worth, he decided that he was going to rebel. And he took his dad's car and drove it all the way to California to visit some family friends. And I'm not sure how he got away with the car, if he actually said that he was going to visit family friends or what. But when he got there, he was like, I'm starting my music career. I'm dropping out of high school, starting my music career. And his dad actually went and borrowed a friend's jet flew it all the way to California to get him and brought him back to Fort Worth and was like, no, you're finishing your schooling, which I thought was really funny.
Yeah, and his dad flew this jet.
Yes.
I mean, this is, this is a world where fighter pilots, you have a friend who has access to a jet, and incidentally, maybe in a government jet.
Yes.
But anyway, so he just gets in the plane, gets in the cockpit, and takes off.
Yep.
So he brings his son back, and his son finished high school.
Yeah, he finished out high school, was still doing a bit in music, and then he went to college at Texas Tech. I'm sure that was something his dad wanted for him because he was studying architecture, which I think it kind of fits with John Denver.
Yeah,
but
a little bit.
But, he loves nature, all that stuff. But then he played in a couple of bands in college, and he eventually dropped out in, I believe, 1963. And he joined he went and played at a couple of clubs, moved to California, was playing at folk clubs there, and then he ended up joining a couple of bands.
Yeah, I think he made his commitment about age 20.
Mm-hmm.
So, at age 20, he decides, heck with this college thing, it's just not me. And so off he goes to California.
Yes.
He gets involved with, I wasn't familiar with the Mitchell Trio.
I wasn't either. I had no idea.
But they apparently had some hits that one hit, I think, broke the top 100.
Huh.
So there were 3 guys in it, and the remaining Mitchell of the 3 dropped out for whatever reason.
Yeah, Chad Mitchell.
So that was Chad.
Mm-hmm.
And then John Denver comes in as his replacement. They rename it as Denver Boys and
Johnson.
Yeah. So
sounds like a
I've
pharmaceutical
never heard of
company.
this before. I'm sure that group didn't have any hits. But so then apparently while he was in that role was when he wrote I'm Leaving on a Jet Plane.
So not quite. He actually from that role, there was like all kinds of, I don't know if just within the band there was controversy, but he dropped out of the band in 1969 and kicked off his solo career. And he signed with RMA Records, and then he wrote Leaving on a Jet Plane, which was originally named like Baby Don't Go or something like that. But he wrote that, and then his producer was like, oh, I like this. And then I don't know whether it was in his contract or he bought it off of him, but then he gave it to another band to sing.
Yeah, I would say that makes sense. Well, you did that chronology because he at the time he did have the sole songwriting rights to that,
Mm-hmm.
so he wouldn't have shared it with any of the other if you were in a group. And it's not unusual to be signed off the label and then a producer with that label who has other musicians and other groups, they'll see a song that's written by one of them and they'll pass it along. This happened with Bob Dylan. Whenever he was signed on with his label, somebody passed, again, Peter, Paul, and Mary, the very, very same people. So they must have had channels by which they were getting these songs.
Which I think it's so funny that they got multiple songs.
Oh, they
it's
did.
Interesting.
And they didn't write them.
Yeah.
Now, they may have wrote, what is it? Puff the Magic Dragon.
Oh, yeah.
They may have written that one. But other than that, their hits, they really had a knack, or somebody managing them had a knack for feeding them really good songs. And Blowing in the Wind was, Bob Dylan was utterly unknown. And all of a sudden, this song became number 1 in the country for a time. And suddenly Bob Dylan, people are saying, who's this songwriter? But still, it's Peter, Paul, and Mary that did it. So in this case, Peter, Paul, and Mary were given this song that Denver had written, and it became a hit. I don't know how high up the charts it went.
I think it was like number 2 or 3 on the charts. And then it's really funny because John Denver, after all that happened, went back a couple years later and wrote or sang the song, recorded it. And then he charted at number 2 in the UK.
Doing the same song.
Yeah, doing the same song. I was like, that's interesting.
So, and I guess that this is the song that got on to his first album that that didn't do real well. Some have suggested that was really the breakout song on the album.
Yeah, it was. And that was the first record that he produced, recorded with RCA Records. They signed him on for just that one. But it's interesting because he did have that breakout song. The album didn't do great, but they didn't send him on tour to promote the album at all. They didn't really do a whole lot of promotion. So he took it upon himself and he went throughout the Midwest and just like asked clubs if he could like perform or sell CDs or anything like that, and just bothered the heck out of people to perform and in schools, everything. And then once he would get a place to let him use it as a venue, he would actually go to the local radio station and show up with his guitar, and he would be like, "Hey, I have a moment for, like a set if you guys want me to sing live." And so he really built his own fan base out of that. And I think it's super interesting because we see most artists who, and I don't want to call it a flop album, but who don't have a great album that, immediately takes off. But he definitely paved his way for himself to make sure that he had a fan base.
Yeah, he had a great work ethic, and early on at least. And is it surprising, though, again, talking about those qualities we discussed a few minutes ago, he's very charismatic.
Yes.
Very zealous.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see how, that guy's showing up in your studios, knocking on your doors, you're a radio station. I mean, I can see him in front of audiences.
Yeah.
He had that real charm I saw him live at least once. I may have seen him twice, I guess. But he was very captivating.
Mm-hmm.
He told jokes. He had stories to tell. You could tell the audience really loved him.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, too, because it's such a 180 from how he was as a child, because he was an Army brat. He was very kept to himself, introverted, didn't really have a lot of friends because, he couldn't make them because he knew he was going to leave them. So I think that once he got into adulthood, he didn't want that anymore for himself. And I think he wanted to be the complete opposite of what his dad was. And I think that's why he turned himself into that charismatic person who could tell the jokes and get on radio shows without having a spot in the first place.
Yeah. And that raises a good point. You think that person that we're talking about probably somebody didn't ever end up with with a lot of close relationships. They were broadly admired and liked. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I think of Ronald Reagan. But there are people who, we know these people. Jimmy Carter may have been one of them, who you put them on stage and they're real charming and you like them a lot. And you think, wow, when you left to spend a weekend with this person.
Yeah.
But then you read about them and they're really not good on being very intimate, having close relationships one-on-one. And like Reagan, people argued he knew him. And Carter was a little bit of a different thing where he might have been the people who knew him didn't really like him, which is a little bit, but they have in common the fact that they really project this very lovable, likable persona. And I don't know that it's fake because I think that's Denver was being himself and that's what he knew to do on a stage. And he probably did feel comfortable with 100 people, but he didn't want to be with one or two. Maybe.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think he had like you said, very few close friends. I don't think he was a mean guy by any means.
No, I've never heard that story. Yeah,
I just think very introverted, didn't really experience the whole friendship thing much as a kid because he couldn't. So he just didn't keep like a lot of close people.
So he as he was building his career and really before, he was very much an outdoorsman, wasn't he? He loved the outdoors.
Absolutely loved the outdoors. Annie, his first wife, he married her in 64 and
68.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I don't know why I remember that
67. We were both. Sorry,
what we should do? We should take what you say, and I say we should average them. The price.
There we go. That's perfect.
So they married in 67.
Married in 67, yes. And then they actually went camping all the time. They took their children out all the time. And right in all of this, we'll get back to it, but he released his second album in 71, and that was where Take Me Home...
That was a hit.
Yeah, that was where Take Me Home, Country Road came from. So when him and his wife and a couple of friends were on a camping trip in Colorado, they were, really happy about the success of the song. Him and Annie were really happy, and he bought land in Aspen, Colorado, and lived there his whole entire life. He did not like the city, and I don't know if that was a lot to do with like his childhood or just his personality, but hated the city, loved the country, bought multiple pieces of land, turned a lot into like conservations, was on a lot of boards for conservation, and just
very
loved
committed.
It. Yes.
And man, his love affair with Colorado.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And that's what I find funny. So he was originally born with the last name, I'm going to have to look at this to say it, Deutschendorf.
Yeah, Deutschendorf.
Deutschendorf, yeah. And one of his friends at the start of his career came up to him and was like, that's not going to fit on the marquee. You're going to need to change your name. So
sage advice.
Yeah, so he changed it to Denver because he loved Denver. But
yeah, Denver, Colorado.
Yeah, so interesting.
So he's very much into hiking, very much into nature, loved nature, fanatical. Those remember the thing with Jacques Cousteau?
Yeah.
You remember? So he did a video that was very popular. It might have originated through PBS, through the efforts of PBS in the U.S., but that film was just beautiful. And he wrote music for it, and the music became a hit. The song he did for, I don't remember the name of it, but it was for the Cousteau and the trip. He really loved nature, and so he did. He accumulated land in Colorado, well over 1,000 acres. He dedicated a large tract of that to conservation, and he created a not-for-profit foundation that was intended to have on this land these facilities for people to come and get close to nature. It was kind of a political and social agenda, but it related to ecology. It related to nature. So he wasn't active politically broadly. He was active politically to the extent that primarily to the extent that it related to nature, to ecology, etc. There were a few things that he certainly had an interest in the poor and a lot of those subjects we think about being the object of charity by celebrities. But for the most part, Denver was very much a guy who cared about nature.
Yeah.
And it was refreshing that he was so focused on that he was able to raise resources, to accumulate resources, as well as to persuade others to give millions of dollars to these projects that were based in Colorado largely. Even the National Wildlife Foundation partnered at one point when he accumulated this land, this tract of land that he had great visions for. And that was actually governed by, was it the WinStar?
WinStar, yes. That was his big
it was
land.
It was kind of, you're right, it was kind of an umbrella organization. And its purpose existed to create this marvelous place where people could come to know nature better, become more aware of the political and social side of some of these issues. It was a grand vision, and it was a vision that cost him a ton of money.
Yes.
So much money that, in fact, he ran out almost trying to keep this vision alive, that ultimately you didn't have, this is my assessment, you didn't have the MBAs involved and those who are savvy financially, and I think that there was probably a lot of money. Some have said that there was a lot of money wasted, that there were things incurred, there were buildings built and structures erected that were not a priority or shouldn't have been, and ultimately, after his death, this organization ran out of money. So the land, it still exists as a conservational property.
Yes.
I guess is what you would call it.
Yeah, we'll talk about this, but the new owner, it was in the deed, or, when you sell a home, they stipulated that he can't build certain things on it. Yeah, and that is what's wonderful about this land, and people who now look back and see how his vision, or this great foundation that was really the primary object of his life, I think it's safe to say, it no longer functions exactly as he intended,
but it does have this restriction in the deed that's not going to go away. So this land is still used for the public and for people who want to learn more about nature, et cetera. But by no means is it what he had in mind. It's stripped down largely.
Yeah.
And the National Wildlife Foundation came in and helped, but eventually they pulled out. So there just wasn't enough money. But this will tie in when we talk about estate planning in a few minutes too. So let's talk a little bit about Country Roads.
Yeah.
So that's his second album, right?
Yes. So Poems, Prayers, and Promises was his second album in 1971, and this was really his breakthrough album. Take Me Home, Country Road was on it, and it charted at number 2 on the billboards. But this is interesting that there's like speculation that it probably would have charted at number 1, but the original like copies or whatever, like how music is distributed to radio stations, it went out and it had track issues on it. So it was like very...
It's flawed?
Yeah, and it wasn't the greatest sound. So that's all they had to play for a while until people realized it and they were able to send out new copies and new recordings and everything. But it still charted at number 2.
So those initial demos were so bad that some people may have turned against the song before they heard the real.
Yeah, and I truly think that. I don't know what was charting at number 1 at the same time, but I truly think it would have charted at number 2. And I mean, like I said, it still is a very relevant song today. Everybody
It's a
knows
marvelous song. I wonder how many of you watching this, just agree that was an incredible song.
Yes.
A little bit more about that is there was a group called with Bill and Taffy Danoff, and they later had a separate group. What was the name, Justin? Look up the name of what Bill and Taffy Danoff.
So Bill and Taffy, Take Me Home, Country Road, Afternoon Delight.
Afternoon Delight was the hit of that.
Starland Vocal Band.
All right, Starland Vocal Band. So this was kind of a acoustic-based group, popular, those of us who remember popular in that era, the late 60s, early 70s. And Denver was performing, not real famous at the time, keep in mind. He was performing in the same city where they were. And they met and they struck up a friendship. And Bill and Taffy were a lot of fun if you've ever seen them on interviews and stuff. They were kind of like these flower children, more or less, that played music. And Denver gets with them. The three of them really hit it off, and they disclose to John Denver that they have partially written a song that they hope to sell. This may be wrong, but check me on this. I think they originally were thinking that Johnny Cash would do this song, I think. Anyway, it certainly wasn't John Denver. So John Denver hears the song that, remember, it's just in a state of construction. So they spend an evening working on it, and Denver has some ideas. So they work on it. It becomes a very different tune from what it was, or at least much improved. And they decided, I think, just hearing the three of them singing it, working on it together, that Denver was the natural voice to be the lead singer, the voice we immediately think of. We hear John Denver. But I suggest you listen to that song closely and you hear Taffy Danoff's voice in the background. I'm telling you, she had this wonderful angelic voice, but you have to pay attention to hear it. But once you hear it, you'll find that you're regularly tuning into it when you hear that song from then on. So listen to the female voice, at times quite strong, on Take Me Home, Country Roads.
Yeah. I think I know exactly what you're talking about but I think it's odd that he didn't credit her, but it makes sense.
Well, so they, but I think they were all happy. They all made a lot of money on this song.
That's very true. Very true.
But it's funny, it's known as John Denver's song.
Yeah.
And all the money's in the writing credits anyway.
That's true.
That's true. Did you
true.
find out who, this is probably something you can't look up quickly, who they originally intended that song to be for?
I didn't see it. I can keep looking, but I didn't see it.
Okay. It's not important. But so that really was the launching pad.
Yeah.
Take Me Home, Country Road was the launching pad. But he was a gifted writer, and he would have written successful songs anyway.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. And I think that took him to his next albums, his next songs, and I think that song even took him really to his TV career, which he started in '73, and it was the John Denver Show.
Oh, did that start that early?
Yeah.
73.
73.
Wow.
Actually, you were right. It was Johnny Cash.
I can't
so
see
funny.
Johnny Cash
No,
doing that song.
not at all.
So 73.
Mm-hmm.
So that was early. I thought that would have come later, but
Yeah, and I mean, he had a couple of different TV shows. So he had one in '73, and then he had a live concert that he actually won an Emmy for around like '74, '75, I believe, which I thought was really interesting. And then he had a show with his dad too. After that,
I didn't know that. His dad?
Yeah, it was so. His dad taught him to fly in the 1970s, the mid 1970s, and they really reconciled there. And they
I should
bonded.
say so.
Yeah, they bonded a lot, and then they went on to create a TV show that was all about flying and airplanes and all kinds of stuff. And it won a couple of awards. I'm not sure exactly what ones, but
Yeah, his dad was an air jock.
Yes,
I mean, he was one of those guys.
oh yeah. And I think he really wanted to be that because he really loved flying after that. And I mean, like we were talking about, he has 2,400 hours of flying.
At least
which
2,400,
That's a lot.
He had, for an individual who's not doing it as a career.
No, yeah.
And he had a lot of ability to fly. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But so he wrote a number of songs that kind of identified him as a sort of a folk singer, which there was a place for that in the early 70s. The second half of the 70s, we went to disco, and there was this sharp division. You had to choose, are you a fan of plain old rock and roll, or are you a fan of disco? And if you weren't in one of those two camps, in the late 70s, there just wasn't much room for anybody else.
Yeah.
And it's a shame because I think that sound that really existed from the late 60s to the mid 70s, that very, very folk sound, I thought there was a lot to commend it.
Yeah. And Justin and I were talking about this earlier. I think it's so interesting because it was only like that point in time that folk was really big, and then it really went away for a while. And now, my generation, there's tons of folk singers that we all love. And I think there's something so unique about them because it's kind of like John Denver. They're just in all sorts of different ranges. And they can do, it's like folk is really all over the place between like country and a little bit more rock and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think they're just like very talented singers. But I find it really interesting that it's coming. I don't think it ever died, but it's, coming back more.
Yeah, my daughter has mentioned that too. When I think about John Denver as a writer, if someone tries to compare him to somebody like, say, Bob Dylan, then of course he falls way short in a lot of ways, except as a singer. But as a writer, I mean, there were some very serious, heavy writers from the 60s that excelled. I mean, Joni Mitchell, people who, Neil Young. There were just a number of very good folkish writers, and their lyrics were poetry. So who would have thought that would happen? But those of us who have listened to Dylan and have really paid attention to his lyrics, we know that, what's great about Bob Dylan is in the lyrics. So if you listen to that and then you look at Denver, you can see why a lot of people frowned upon him and were dismissive about him because they thought he was a lightweight intellectually, even artistically. And I think that was unfair because he wasn't trying to probe, these great societal or philosophical questions. That wasn't what he was doing.
Yeah.
He had a message that largely surrounded nature and simplicity and family, but he wasn't trying to plumb those depths. If he had tried and failed, then yeah, he would. I think people would have had harsher criticism.
Yeah.
John Denver is such a rich topic for us that we can't realistically cover this in the 30 minutes or so that we like to do when we talk about these celebrities. Often we'll give 30 to 40 minutes. In this case, we're going to be north of an hour, so we want to break it into 2 parts. So this will conclude today's part, and then we'll pick up on the part 2, covering the second half of John Denver's life as well as the issues regarding his estate, which is really the opportunity to really learn. Incidentally, if you like this show, be sure and hit the like button and definitely hit subscribe. Thank you. See you for part 2.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.